and Councillor Hampton is substituting.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest, please? No. Okay, let's look back at the minutes. So we've got the 9th of November and the 16th of November. So let's start with the 9th of November. First of all, are these a correct record of the meeting, please? Yeah, people are indicating. Thank you. And then we'll look at the minutes of the meeting on the 16th of November. Are these a correct record, please? Yeah, people are nodding. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so we've reordered the agenda, and we're going to take the East Norwich update.
Sorry,
first.
Chair. Chair, no, we've got the agenda in a particular order for a reason. It's that officers are going to join us for the second part. So that is why we're taking the adoption of the Norfolk Green first, please. Thanks.
We are taking that first.
Yes,
so
we are. Sorry, I was just explaining to our guests. That's why the order was in it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Okay. Apologies for that, and apologies to our other guests who are going to have to sit through this. So we're going to do GIRAMs first, are we? We're going to stick with the order on the agenda. Okay. Is everybody happy with that? Okay.
Chair, that's what I was advised by the officers. I don't know whether Judith wants to explain. Thank you.
It was just that for the East Norwich report, I think that Graham and Sarah Ashurst weren't able to make the beginning of the meeting, so we felt that we put the GRAMs bit on first, item on first because of that.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Okay. Well, let's do the GIRAMs report. Is that you, Judith?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Just to say, first of all, that this report is going to Cabinet on Wednesday, so in a couple of days' time. So if there's any comments that are made by officers as part of this meeting, we can report those to Cabinet on Wednesday. Just to give you, I'll try to keep the introduction to this report brief. I'm sure you've all had a look at it, but essentially, the Council has a legal duty to comply with the Habitats and Species Regulations of 2017 in relation to potential impacts on habitat sites arising from new development. And just for your information, habitat sites incorporate various different sorts of designations, special protection areas known as SPAs, special areas of conservation, and Ramsar sites, which relate to wetlands. So the recreational pressures do arise from residential growth, and they can impact on these habitat sites. And the fact that this is a cross-boundary issue, and it's being looked at on a cross-boundary basis, on a Norfolk-wide basis. Because of that, it will affect all local plans and local planning authorities in Norfolk. Obviously, within Norwich itself, we don't have any designated habitat sites, but we have they are spread throughout the county, mainly on the coast, the North Norfolk coast and the East Coast, for example, the Brawls area, the Brecks, etc. The nearest one that we have is the Wensum Special Area of Conservation, which lies just outside the city boundary. So just as a bit of context, really, but this is it's a cross-boundary issue, and it's being addressed through the Norfolk Strategic Planning Framework and the Norfolk Strategic Member Forum. A couple of years ago, the Member Forum commissioned Place Services to undertake this GIRAM study, which is the Norfolk-wide Green Infrastructure and Recreational Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I will just call it the GIRAMs. It was completed in March 2021, and it's informed the policy and the emerging Greater Norwich Local Plan, which is currently at public examination. And just in summary, it's proposed that we adopt the GIRAMs document, which provides the evidence base for this tariff, and we start collecting the tariff from the end of this month, from the 31st of March. And that will be collected by all Norfolk authorities. And that its intention is to mitigate the impact of new residential development on these protected sites. And if we didn't do that, if we didn't have a relevant policy in place and a relevant mitigation strategy, all the local planning authorities in Norfolk could potentially face legal and soundness issues or challenges. And possibly there is also potential that Natural England could start to object to planning applications for new development, new housing development, thus affecting housing delivery. So this is important. It's something we have to do because of the habitats regulations. And the purpose of this report is really just to acknowledge that, approve the GRM's strategy, and to recommend to Cabinet that it approves that strategy and that we start collecting the RAMS tariff. So that tariff is set at £185.93 per additional dwelling. And as I said, it will be introduced from the end of this month. And just to say also, it's referred to in the report, but there are governance arrangements being developed at the moment. But essentially, there will be an independent board that will make decisions about the spending of this money once it's collected. And it will have representation from all the Norfolk authorities, members and officers. But the detail of all these arrangements are being sort of developed as we speak, really, and we'll know more about those in a couple of months' time. So that's just a very brief introduction to the report. I'm happy to answer any specific questions you have on it. I'll give you any more further detail if you require it. Thank you.
Myself and yes, I can unmute myself. I was trying and it wouldn't let me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Okay, so the other thing I would say is that this is something which has been negotiated between the authorities in the county and the county council. So it's been quite a delicate balance in some ways to get to a point where there's something that we can all agree on. So again, you know, it's something which is a bit of a potentially could be seen as a bit of a compromise. So just to be aware, well, we can make recommendations to Cabinet, obviously, but if we try and unpick bits of it, the chances are it's all going to unravel, and then we'll end back at square one. So just to let you know that's the case, but we can make any recommendations we wish, of course. So we'll start with Leslie.
Thank you. Well, you've just answered my first question, which is to check the assumption that it's take it or leave it. We can't actually tweak it in any way at this point. My other questions were about the data and how long and when that will be reviewed. So, for example, on page 71, it says 77% of people visiting sites go by car, so 23% don't. But that was measured in 2015, and you would expect that to change one way or another during the lifetime of the plan between now and 2036. I also had a question about the zero costings for admin, which I don't think is realistic. And there is mention of a review of the amount of money. And I wonder how we can make sure that that happens and is effective so that they can actually afford to do the projects they want to do, probably increase those projects as housing growth continues.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of updating, keeping the package and the relevant the tariff up to date, there is, as you said, there's going to be a review of the tariff within a reasonably in about an 18-month period. So it's at paragraph 15 of the report. The intention is to complete the review of the GIRAMs within 18 months from adoption. So, within the next 18 months approximately. Yes, I think that's really important, that we do need to keep it up to date and refresh the information that it's based on. So a brief is currently being worked up for that review. So that certainly is something we're looking at. I think you mentioned about admin costs. Was that in relation to within the financial resources part of the committee paper? Was that?
No, it was towards the end of the GRAM's document, and there's a table, a traffic light table, and it's, I'm not sure if I could identify it again now, but I probably could if you give me a moment and maybe take another question while I find it.
Well, I can just, while you're doing that, I can just say within the report itself, we have addressed some of the financial issues, and we've said paragraph 26, there'll be some additional cost to the authority to do with things like a greater number of validations by the planning validation team and collection of the tariff and so on. But we feel that they can be largely met within the existing resources of the planning service. But the actual costs associated with the implementation and the management of the RAMS mitigation. So when we collect the money, it will be it'll be managed by this board that I was referring to earlier. That will be funded through the collection of the tariff contributions. So yes, there is some resource implication for us, but not one that we feel can be covered within our planning resource for the service.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, please? Denise.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Judith, for an interesting report. I had a brief look at the report, and I wondered about funds being collected also from visitor accommodation, because a number of visitors to the site obviously are on holiday or whatever. My second question then, Judith, is about visitor travel plans, because there's quite a bit of emphasis on using the funds to providing parking at the sites. And so I wondered actually about visitor travel plans to encourage non-car access. And then thirdly, please, I wanted to ask about monitoring. If monitoring, and I presume it's going to be by independent ecologists, if monitoring finds that there are still impacts on these particular sites, will there be money available to carry out further mitigation work?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, on the point about visitor accommodation, I think were you asking whether visitor accommodation would be liable to pay the tariff? Yes. Yes, in the paragraph 17 of the report, it does clarify the different sorts of qualifying development. So holiday caravans, touring pitches, campsites, they're included. So there is some, of that sort of development will have to pay for the tariff. Will have to pay the tariff. So all new residential development, I think will include holiday homes. So that's the intention, is to capture some of that contributions towards the tariff. In terms of visitor travel plans, those will be, it's an interesting point. I think that they will be required through the development in those areas where that sort of development is being dealt with through the planning process. So I can feed that point back. It's quite an interesting point. I think, to feed it back to the other officers that are dealing with this. Yes. Monitoring of the impacts on sites. Well, part of the role of the there'll be a delivery officer set out in the GI RAMS document what the package of measures is that the RAMS is containing. There'll be a delivery officer, there'll be rangers, a team of rangers to be a presence at the habitat sites. It does talk about monitoring. That's more to do with monitoring of residential development, so that triggers the tariff. But I think there is, as part of that as well, there is monitoring of the impacts on the habitat sites. So I can check that out, but I believe that is part of it, the monitoring role that will be carried out by the delivery officer. But I think we will be having to, the Norfolk officers, look at a job description for the delivery officer and the terms of reference for the board and everything. So I think that's something I can feed back again into that discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Are there any other questions, please? Leslie?
Thank you. I found it's the costings table I was looking at is page 110 of the GRAMS document. And the point I want to make from it is that if it's going to cost us something, if we can find it within our resources, that's great, but we might want to use any flexibility we have there for other things that we're struggling with. So if we were going to try and raise more money for our part in it, then it might be better to do it now than further on in, but it may be we have to wait to the next review. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask if you could give us an example of how the GRAMS would work. So for example, how would it impact on East Norwich or Whitlingham Lane or Thorpe Woods, if at all?
Yeah, the actual GRAMS report as a whole it's partly to do with green infrastructure provision and partly to do with mitigating the impact of recreational growth or housing growth on these protected sites. So if I just find the relevant bit of the report, I do note what the Greater Norwich Local Plan policy is saying. So we're, as well as collecting the contribution towards the cost of mitigation, the sites will be, all residential development will address potential visitor pressure through the provision or enhancement of adequate green infrastructure, either on the development site itself or nearby, to provide for the informal recreational needs of residents as an alternative to visiting the protected sites. So it's a two-pronged strategy. We're trying to take people away from those sites, or provide other things, places for them to go more locally. And just to be aware that we have a green infrastructure strategy at the moment, but it's quite out of date, and we're considering commissioning a new green infrastructure strategy for Greater Norwich that will then help to identify the priorities for green infrastructure in the Greater Norwich area, so that then we'll be able to achieve that part of the Greater Norwich Local Plan policy to provide recreational GI for development arising in this area. So that is the other prong of the policy, really. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but I'm still not clear. So say if thousands of new homes get built in East Norwich, and a lot of those people would go to Whitlingham Park because it's a nice place to be. So would Whitlingham Park be considered as an alternative natural space for them to visit in the policy, or would it be considered as a space that needs protection?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, this green infrastructure strategy hasn't been done yet. I mean, I think it may, there's a sort of natural capacity to Whitlingham. It's quite sort of constrained in a way. So it might not have, certainly I'm sure it'll have capacity for additional recreational use, because we're through the East Norwich work, it'll be connected up much more effectively from the city centre. But it may or may not have the capacity to attract lots of additional recreation journeys from elsewhere. It will have to be subject to assessment through a green infrastructure strategy that's yet to be done. Really, it's hard to I can't sort of say at this moment in time what the answer to it is in East Norwich. Okay, but yes, we'll be looking for green infrastructure areas, the potential for visitors around the Greater Norwich area. That's, that would really help in terms of reducing impacts on the protected sites.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. If there are no further questions, is there anything we would like to say to Cabinet about the Denise? You're on mute.
Yes. Could I ask Judith another question on the back of a interesting point Judith has just made, please? And that is, Judith, you said that the GNDP are looking at, is it additional areas around Norwich, green infrastructure areas, to take some of the pressure off
Well, as part of the study that has yet to be carried out,
yeah,
it will be looking for green infrastructure opportunities and to try and guide decisions about where this green infrastructure will be located in the light of the Greater Norwich Local Plan policy. Yes.
Okay. Yes. No, I heard I heard Natural England's concerns expressed at the GNLP examination in relation to green infrastructure and some of their concerns about shortcomings. So yes, I was interested to hear your comments that there might be a further strategy and looking at further possible sites.
Yes, I mean the existing one is very much out of date now, so it's this is an opportunity to get a much better understanding of green infrastructure, and also there's a lot of government initiatives coming out now, such as the Local Nature Recovery Networks, Biodiversity Net Gain, will help inform all of that forthcoming work as well.
Can I just ask very briefly then, please? Would that work have to be completed before adoption of the GNLP, or how does it tie in?
I don't suppose it actually has to be. I think the adoption of the GNLP, I think, has been a little bit delayed and is likely to be early next year, as far as I'm aware, but I don't know for sure. I'm not incredibly close to it at the moment, but if we're able to start this study this year, it might be adopted by the time it might be complete by the time of the adoption, but even if it's a little bit later, it would still be able to impact on implementation of the policy.
Yeah.
I think it would be feasible that it could be completed by next year, this time next year. So,
okay, thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Okay, so I was going to ask, is there anything we want to say to Cabinet? And I don't think there is. I think Judith has picked up some of the comments that have been made, and we've answered some questions. But I think I'm assuming we're content for this to go forward to Cabinet. Yeah. Yeah, people are nodding. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, let's move then on to, we now move on to East Norwich. So we do have our esteemed guests with us. I can see Sarah is with us now. We've got Ian, project manager, and we've also got Martin, and we've also got Anthony. Now, I think both of you have spoken to this meeting before, haven't you? So we don't need to do introductions, but suffice it to say that you're very welcome here. It's good to have you back to give us an update. Can I just, before we start, just ask Ian, Ian, have you spoken to this meeting before?
I haven't, Chair. That's why I was just waving my hand when you said that.
Yeah, okay.
On November the 17th, which I think was one day after your previous meeting. So this is the first time for being in this forum.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Ian Chari. I'm the interim project manager for the East Norwich project. Been on board, as I say, since November the 17th. So overseeing really the stage 2 work, given that was the kind of cut-off Cabinet on November the 17th that agreed the stage 1 master plan work. So I'm not sure, Judith, I thought you were going to say perhaps a few words of introduction, and then Martin Saunders, I think he's going to give the main presentation, but I'm happy to assist as you wish, Chair.
Thanks for that, Ian. Yes, so you're going to give some words of introduction, Judith? Is that going to be you?
Thanks. Well, I wasn't going to say very much, Chair. I was just going to say that a lot has happened since we last met on the 9th of November to discuss this, and I think the report sets it out, quite comprehensively. The formal stage 2 outputs are set out in paragraph 2 of the report, and there is an infrastructure delivery plan, work on viability, a draft supplementary planning document. So work has been progressing very, very quickly. It's still work in progress, but quite a lot of progress has been made despite that. There's been some, the consultants will probably fill us in a bit further on that, but there have been some extra studies done through with Homes England funding, looking at the feasibility of the pedestrian cycle link through the underpass, at the Trice Rail underpass, and also some flood modelling work as well. And as it says in the report, there's been a listings review of assets, historic assets throughout the East Norwich sites, and a number of buildings are being listed for the first time, which is very helpful and provides greater certainty for all parties. And as you mentioned, or as was mentioned earlier, the Greater Norwich Local Plan examination is on at the moment, and there was a session on East Norwich specifically about a month ago, I think, virtually a month ago, and we're having to provide some additional information to the inspectors of the examination. But hopefully, when the plan is adopted next year, there'll be an allocation for East Norwich within it. So I think I'll just leave it at that point. It's all that is set out in the report. If I can hand over to Martin and Anthony to provide a bit more detail on what's been going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you, Chair. And thanks everyone for having us back. I'm just going to share my screen, and then we can, as I said, sort of walk you through a bit of an update to the East Norwich Master Plan process, and we'll touch on some of the key bits of work that Judith has just sort of mentioned as we go through. So we thought it was worth, just before we dive into the detail, I know this covered a bit in Judith's paper that she's introduced, just start by just reminding everyone the process we're on, and we're conscious that it's been a while since we've had the pleasure of speaking at one of these meetings, and when we met last time it was sort of completing the stage 1 process. But just to remind everybody, particularly conscious we've got some different people on the call today, or sorry, in the meeting today, we obviously started the process back in April last year, so we're going at this just under 12 months with a baseline stage where we did a lot of sort of listening and learning and sort of stakeholder engagement. And that sort of concluded in July last year with a sort of public exhibition and drop-in session held at Carrow Abbey. And then since then, and as we sort of culminated in November last year, we've been doing that master planning work. So we came up with a concept master plan and an initial sort of test on deliverability of that in November, which we presented to you and took through. We've got formal cabinet sign-off shortly after, which we were pleased and allowed us to move into a more detailed sort of set of work around some of the deliverability considerations. Now, since December, we've been working through that. That's largely been focused on providing the underpinnings of and the drafting of a new supplementary planning document, which will guide the development of East Norwich going forward, and will nest under the GNLP when it is adopted in the hopefully not too distant future. So that's where we are today, and we'll talk about that stage in a bit more detail as we go through the rest of these slides. But just so everyone's aware, obviously what we will have post or in tandem with the GNLP adoption, in a timescale yet to be determined or confirmed, is that the SPD document will actually be an adopted bit of planning guidance, and obviously we'll be there in advance of that. Will be part of a more formal public consultation, which we have yet to program in once we know the GNLP process. So zooming into what we've been doing in that sort of block around the SPD drafting stage. So we took the stage 1 master plan and we sort of shared it with key stakeholders after it had been signed off by the cabinet. And then really we entered into sort of early January, or even the end of sort of mid-December into early January, doing a series of feedback sessions so that we could really understand views on how both technical stakeholders and landowners saw that stage 1 master plan, because obviously it was brought together in November, and really then was the first point at which everyone had the time to digest what was in the document and how all of the technical elements came together as one proposition. So we met with all the landowners, for everyone from Fuel Properties, who are the development partner for Britvic Unilever, Network Rail, National Grid, and all of the other key parties. We've also had a series of technical meetings to make sure that the strategies we were setting out in that stage 1 master plan were the right interpretation of the conversations we had during stage 1. So everything from movement and access through sort of the economic strategy and the employment uses. Education was a key one to make sure that we were getting the right approach to delivering education facilities. And actually one session that we're having in 2 days' time, just to prove that the conversations haven't stopped, is with sort of the bus services to understand how that might play out from a more public sustainable transport mode as well. So hopefully you can see there a lot of time has been invested in working with the right technical partners, as well as our own team, to make sure that everything embedded in the SPD as we go forward is where it should be. As Judith said, we've been doing an enormous amount of work. The work streams we already had in the process had been added to by 2 sort of key other bits of technical work. So what we produced in sort of end of Jan, early Feb, across 2 sort of reporting deadlines just to manage our own workloads, was the infrastructure delivery plan, a first cut of that, and we'll come back to that later, so don't worry about that so much for now. But again, a document that has then being engaged upon. We also 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago now, shared with stakeholders the first cut of the SPD, which evolved that stage 1 master plan, and again, comments are now being fed back to us from all of those stakeholders. And we did some other work around sort of viability, refining the approach to understanding how deliverable all of the propositions in that SPD are. Critically, and we will come back to this, and we've also done some specific flood modelling to understand, address some of the concerns particularly raised at this group, but amongst others as well, that we are dealing with and appropriately managing the significant flooding issues that the sites have. And it was just mentioned the key piece around connectivity between Carrow Works and the deal ground through the underpass, and sort of some initial feasibility work to understand if it is possible to reuse that. All of that sort of then moves forward, and then by sort of late March into April, we will be finalising all of those pieces of work, adding one more piece of work to that, which is what we're calling our delivery report, which starts to bring together viability, the strategies around funding and financing, and then sort of how some of these elements might start to be brought forward. And that will be how, at this point, we conclude the study. So Anthony, I'm going to pass over to Anthony so he can take you through how we've moved from that stage 1 master plan into the stage 2 SPD.
Thank you, Martin. So yes, so as Martin said, the first stage of our work really was to prepare a master plan for the whole of the East Norwich area. And then we are now taking that master plan and the principles that it's based upon into the drafting of the supplementary planning documents. So we will have shared with you emerging thoughts about the principles that have informed the emergence of this master plan framework for the area in previous presentations. So I just thought it would be worth at this point sharing with you some of the highlights on the current phase of work, which is amending the stage 1 master plan as of November last year into the SPD version of the master plan. And those changes relate specifically to the feedback that we've received in all of those engagement sessions that Martin talked about. Just to be clear, there have been 2 stages of public engagement, and there will need to be a further formal stage of public engagement at the point when the draft SPD is then intended to be adopted. So there needs to be an additional phase of public consultation. So there have been 2 phases of informal public consultation, and really, I suppose, an ongoing dialogue with all the relevant landowners and stakeholders as required during the production and the preparation of the master plan and the SPD itself. So that slide that you are looking at was the November version of the master plan, and the kind of headline deliverables in relation to quantum of development that yielded was in detail was 3,470 new homes with an anticipated approximate job creation opportunity of about 4,000 new jobs. I think it is also important to say that this is quite a detailed drawing of a framework that in reality and in the fullness of time, developers will have their own view. They'll put their own ideas forward, and it won't come forward in exactly this form. There will need to be a fair degree of flexibility embedded and captured in the SPD. But it is useful to go into this level of detail in order to have confidence on the sorts of numbers and capacities that we are testing through this process. So this is not a blueprint. This is not a fixed plan. There will be other forms of development that will come forward, but this is a very useful process to have gone through in order to have confidence on the capacity of the site. So the next slide, which has just changed, isn't radically different, but there are actually quite a lot of subtle differences that are captured in that revision, and that really has been the current phase of work. We've had feedback from the landowners and all the stakeholders, the regulatory stakeholders, the council departments, etc. And all of that has been fed into the process of reviewing the master plan. That work actually is still ongoing as we move towards the end of our phase of work on drafting this SPD. But this diagram represents a current work in progress representation of the emerging master plan. And you'll notice that I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second about the changes, but you'll notice that the overall number of new homes has gone up a little to 3,630, and the overall number of jobs has also gone up a little bit as we've had a closer look at some of the opportunities and various plots for development. So there are then a series of changes that have occurred, thanks that relate to specific areas of feedback that we've received in discussions with the stakeholders. And this is a heads-up summary of some of the principal ones, organised in 3 parts. So there are access changes, which are captured in the plan or in purple. There are heritage changes that are responses to feedback from Historic England, largely captured in red in the plan. Land use changes captured in yellow, and ecological changes captured in green. And again, this is all work in progress. It's all currently being turned over and viewed at the moment. But just to give you a kind of heads up of the principal changes that are taking place, there was we are keen to promote the concept of public transport corridor through the site. That's not without its challenges, because the roads within the site are not adopted roads. So there's plenty of work still to be done in subsequent stages of work. But I think that is an important principle that we are hoping to support. We've been clear with developers about that in the work and conversations that we've had with them. That does present a number of challenges that would need to be overcome. But I think the principle is an important one. So we've reviewed things in order to strengthen that principle, is one. Another feedback, important area of feedback that we received from the county highways team was the need for adequate levels of emergency access, given concerns about the overall access strategies for all the sites, and access strategy is a big issue for all the sites. They all have issues associated with access. So we've looked at that and tried to respond to feedback we've received from county. A range of changes within and around the centre part of the Carrow work site, and in particular around Carrow Abbey, and that really is responding to feedback received from Historic England, given that they undertook a listings review which reported towards the end of last year. So there are a number of new additional listed buildings within the site, and a number of upgrades of existing listed buildings, and that creates a new set of issues that need to be taken into account in terms of respecting the setting of those identified assets. So we've reviewed the master plan, having met and discussed things with Historic England towards the end of last year. The yellows, so we've reviewed land uses in relation to particular environmental concerns associated with the Tarmac Lafarge depot and the railway track and the Trouse Bridge, etc., giving a bit more emphasis on employment uses to act as a buffer to those noisy and dusty uses along that corridor. That was in response to feedback received from environmental health. And then the final coloured change relates to a boundary revision of the county wildlife site. So the new local plan takes forward a revised boundary for the county wildlife site, which covers the majority of the deal ground site, actually. And so that boundary change became apparent to us during the course of the work, and we've reviewed the master plan to take account of that boundary change. So that's a summary of the principal changes and updates and revisions that are being worked on at the moment to move from stage 1 into this SPD drafting stage. The result will be a supplementary planning document, and that again is a work in progress. As Martin said, we have issued a very initial draft and shared that initial draft internally just with identified stakeholders ahead of a subsequent public consultation which will have to take place. So this is a kind of snapshot of the current structure. It works from a solid base from the stage 1 master plan. So it's not radically different in its structure, and that's how we worked that stage 1 report in order to give us a good head start for this SPD. But broadly speaking, there will be a concise introduction, a review of the context of the site, and really the main parts of it will be in chapters C, D, and E. The vision and objectives will be enhanced from the previous stage of work, just giving it a bit more emphasis on sustainability objectives, which I think is appropriate for the SPD. The guidance, really, the site-wide guidance will be caught in a series of chapters that relate to key principles on key site-wide issues in section D. For example, heritage principles, movement principles, open space and land use, etc. And then section E will give us the opportunity to look in a little bit more spatial detail into each of the character areas across the master plan area, the East Norwich area, and we have identified 4 of those: the river frontage, Carrow Abbey, the kind of southern area of the deal grounds site, and the utilities, the kind of furthest extent of the utilities site. Again, those areas have changed in review in light of feedback received at that initial stage. And so the objective being to set out some development and land use and sustainability, etc., principles that relate to new development, and those principles will be useful for the council in determining planning applications as they come forward. The final section will relate to delivery, which actually I think Martin effectively is going to come on to some of the thinking that will inform that summary section at the end of the SPD. So that's an overview of the SPD. I'll hand back to Martin now, but a couple of issues really that I think you will be, as a Sustainable Development Panel, most particularly interested in and have cropped up in discussions with you previously.
Thanks, Anthony. And I think the first one, and I sort of teed this up earlier, and certainly conversations we've had with you in the past sort of underlined the importance of making sure the master plan is, and the SPD is sort of set on solid foundations in terms of its approach to water and flood management. And when we presented the stage 1 master plan to you, obviously at that point we had reviewed flood models and that were contemporary at the time. But certainly there's lots of sort of comments and feedback about, you know, how does that deal with the future, and, you know, what modelling and working with colleagues at the City Council and the Homes England, we have now, very hot off the press, managed to complete a very detailed exercise in flood modelling. I'm not a flood expert, but I will do my best to give you the headlines of that now, so you can understand what we've been doing. But effectively, what we've been doing is, in agreement with the Environment Agency, we've sort of undertaken specific flood modelling for the East Norwich sites, and from there we have also then been able to test and look at the implications of that modelling for the master plan that Anthony has just talked you through. Effectively, what that's done is taken the existing flood modelling that we sort of talked about in stage one. We've reviewed all of the data that sits within that, and we've done that in partnership with the Environment Agency. And then we've then looked at how we update that for East Norwich, partly to allow for the period, the transition in time. I think the data for the original model that was being used came from about 2017. So obviously there's a passage of time and more information about river flows, river levels, etc. exists from then. So we've updated the base case in the model. And then from there, we've also then run into it, again in agreement with the water management and catchment plans, and in agreement with the Environment Agency, what a climate change impact uplift might look like as well. So we've actually modelled 11 and 20% uplifts in peak levels to understand what climate change might do to the levels of flood risk. Effectively, what that's allowed us to do is, in much more detail than the preset flood modelling and flood mapping that existed when we started this project and when we got to stage one, is to understand the extent and severity of flood risk across all of East Norwich, all of the sites, and then develop out the strategies we need to work with that and make sure that, you know, the master plan that was on the screen is actually future-proofed. And effectively, the way we've done that, and we've talked about some of the strategies before, we've agreed in principle these strategies with the EA during the process as well, to the way we can manage flood risk, and obviously working within the limitations of what we can and can't build on as a starting point. And effectively, there are three elements to the way we can manage flooding on the site. The first being the marinas. Now, there's been a lot of discussion within the team about how we might use boating marinas as a way of helping manage flood risk. They do make a contribution, but I think we're all very clear now that they make a small contribution to that. We shouldn't underestimate it, but it's a very complicated thing to understand, how if you dig out a new basin or marina, how groundwater and all the other sort of influences on the water level in that basin then affect its ability to store flood water or to help manage flood risk. So it does make a contribution, but in the strategy we're talking about, it makes a very small contribution. It's certainly not the thing we are relying on at this point. But what I think I would stress out of that is, when they are looked at, when detailed marina designs are done, we might be able to increase the resilience by actually understanding there's more capacity in those than we can model at this point as sort of conceptual ideas. The next piece, which we've talked to you about before, and the images on the screen sum it up really nicely, is that we have looked at the ability to alter the profile of the river frontages. So effectively taking an 8 to 10 metre amount of land along the northern southern banks of the Wensum, east of Trouse Bridge, and creating a reprofiled riverside sort of walk area that in times of flooding would act as that flood storage, but also be a significant contribution to the placemaking, as you can see from examples in Bath that we've got on the screen of where that's been done successfully already. I'm not saying it will look exactly like that, but you know, that's the kind of approach we can adopt, and that deals with a lot of the risk that the sites face, and allows us also, as I said, to create that really strong interaction between the development and the river, and give that a good setting. But it does mean that it doesn't deal with every single piece of flood risk. And so we've had to then look at strategies to sort of manage that localized sort of residual challenge. And effectively what that means is, in some pockets of the deal ground in particular, we would need to look at some ground reprofiling, not significant scale and not over big areas of land, but effectively reprofiling the low points so that we make sure that any development platform does sit above those levels of flood risk. And that comes with a compensatory measure where we might lower some land in other places to offset that flood storage. That is an approach, it's fair to say, that the NPPF does challenge. It's not a direct challenge to the spirit of the NPPF, but it's certainly it's not their preferred way in the NPPF to deal with these issues. But certainly in the conversations we've had with the Environment Agency, given that the other approaches we're using in terms of, the Riverside Walk and the way we're managing flood in those respects, there is an opportunity to look at ground reprofiling in small areas because we're not doing too many intrusive things elsewhere. So on balance, the flood modelling has showed how we can get to a point of managing flood risk, ensuring that this is resilient. And importantly, and I think it is really important to stress, given that what we've had in the public engagement sessions, it also means that it is managing the knock-on risk for areas that are not within East Norwich. So obviously we've had conversations with the residents of Trouse Millgate in the past about concerns they have about any development on the deal ground in particular impacting them. The modelling work shows that there would be no, I'm thinking of the right word without making it sound like a pun, but I was going to say spillover, but there would be no impact and worsening of conditions for anyone who is not within East Norwich. So we're not making East Norwich better and harming anyone else. So that's, I think, another huge positive out of that modelling work, that we can now confidently have a master plan that does that. So that's how we've dealt with flooding. I think Anthony's already teed this up. We've also been trying to make sure that the SPD is strengthened in terms of the way it deals with sustainable modes of transport. We've talked to you before about the way some of the design works in terms of prioritising walking, wheeling and cycling, but also the key element around that bus route that comes into Carrow Works and the ability to connect that into the wider bus network of the city. And we'll come back to some of the mechanisms for that when we talk about infrastructure in a second, but certainly embedded in the centre of that master plan, in the centre of the SPD, are those principles. And certainly that east-west connection. The other point of doing the underpass feasibility study was to understand how we can use that underpass to get walking and cycling connections effectively through here, so we can create a continuous route from the city all the way through to Whitlingham. And the potential then to have that as a dominant cycle route rather than sort of the Brackendale King Street route that cyclists use today to improve that connection through to Trouse. So again, embedded right at the heart of the SPD, we've got these principles. And then certainly, well, finally for this section of the presentation, but not finally and not of least important, is the thinking around community facilities. We have got embedded in the master plan and now into the SPD the need for a 2 form-entry primary school, and there are multiple opportunities for how that can be delivered. We're showing 4 of those on the screen today. That could be, we think that the analysis shows and the engagement with the Education Authority shows that the preferred location is the Carrow Works side of East Norwich, so that could be looking at opportunities around Carrow House or on the former factory site itself. So we have done some testing around site capacities to be able to bring that in. The SPD will be flexible in terms of how that is achieved and where that is achieved, but certainly we'll set that in terms of something we need East Norwich to deliver. Alongside that, we've done a lot of work with looking at other forms of community space, so looking at community hub building. They've run a model in terms of health needs, and so we know the scale of health needs from the Hoodoo model. And so again, all of those refining the sort of land use schedule that we have in the master plan and into the SPD. What we also all of that sort of we've talked about is embedded in the infrastructure delivery plan, which is a bit of an odd title, but effectively that is our schedule of all of the key infrastructure that we need to make East Norwich happen, and make it happen in a way that delivers good growth and benefits to the communities. It's not solely a housing development, and all of the infrastructure is off-site somewhere. So when we ended stage 1, we had this list of what we classed as essential infrastructure, all of the things that needed to be embedded in the SPD and in all the viability work in order to deliver the aspirations for East Norwich as set out in the vision, as set out in the GNLP policy. So there's everything in there from cycle infrastructure to buses to e-vehicle and e-bike charging points to leisure marinas and bridges and all of that big elements of kit. So the infrastructure delivery plan in a bit more detail sort of organizes those things under a number of key headings. And you can see here the list of the bits of infrastructure that it embeds. And hopefully it's reassuring to you all that it embeds not just roads and bridges and underpasses, but it embeds all of that community and education infrastructure. It embeds all of that flood management that I've just talked about, and all of the open space, environmental, sustainability considerations as well. What the IDP does, and I have in the presentations attempted to share this in the past, and it's a nightmare, but it's a massive spreadsheet that sets out those infrastructure items, the cost of delivering them, and then where the benefits fall. And that last part is really important, because one of the things we're looking at, and I'll come on to in a second, is how do we make sure that these pieces of infrastructure come forward? Now, some of them, the benefit is to the development within which it can sit. And that will be a piece of infrastructure that we would expect, obviously, through usual development mechanisms to come forward. Others, like a bridge over the River Wensum between the utility site and deal ground, which has ped cycle connections, or the connection under the railway between Carrow Works and the deal ground, has a bigger city-wide level of benefit. And therefore, that is something that we need to think about. Well, how is that delivered? How is that paid for? And that forms a part of our delivery strategy work that we're now working through. But what we do have is all of that captured, all of that costed, and then all of those costs feeding into our viability model. So I think one of the questions we've had in these sessions before is, it's great to put them down on a piece of paper and say we want them, but how do we try and make sure they happen? And that is the process for getting to that. We know what viability is with them built in. So our delivery strategy takes the IDP, takes the master plan, takes the viability work, and then looks at how we make this happen. Now this is understandably, because it's the delivery piece, it's the last piece of work for us to really do. So we are now only embarking on this, but I thought it was worth sharing today sort of the headlines of where it's headed. So the first point is to understand viability. We are moving to a point where we can get the position across the whole of East Norwich and on individual sites where it is deliverable. That has some assumptions in it around how some of the items I'll come on to in a minute are fed in terms of funding, support and investment. But it is starting to move in a positive direction compared to where we finished stage 1. And that also looks at phasing and sequencing. So that looks at how best to deliver development and infrastructure so that we are managing cash flow, managing viability as we go through. We're also looking at the use of Section 106 and community infrastructure levy within that. So we have allowances for that to deliver not just that list of infrastructure I've talked about, but all of the other usual things a development would deliver, whether that's fire, contributions to the fire service, police, libraries, and all of those things that aren't necessarily site specific. So we make sure that's in there as well. So we're not getting one at the cost of another. And that includes actually the GI RAMS conversation that Judith had earlier with you. So we've got that built in as well. And then we started to look at, well, what are the funding and financing challenges to this? And we're now really getting into the detail of how do we overcome that? And how do we look to potentially the public sector to help fund some of these elements, particularly, as I said, where there are pieces of infrastructure that have a benefit which is much greater than just unlocking development on these sites. And as I said, those bridges, those connections are some of the obvious examples of that. And then we look at other ways we can deliver. So that might be things like what we've titled here, investment for return, which might be actually that we can find other people to invest in the area. It might be the public sector, it might be the private sector, to deliver bits of infrastructure because they generate an income over the long term. And then finally, it's about the delivery approaches. If we take all into account, what's the best way of bringing this forward? And that's where we work very closely with the landowners to make sure there is coordination across sites, and that we might look at particular partners to deliver particular elements of the project going forward. But all of that set out at high level. And then obviously, as we move beyond our stage 2 work and the SPD, really into the sort of landowners court to start bringing forward development against that context. So that, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know, is the end of us sort of taking you through the master plan. Obviously, Anthony, myself, and I'm sure Ian as well, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Martin and Anthony, and also Judy for her introduction, and also Ian, who I'm sure will be helping us with answers to questions. And that was very comprehensive, and aligns pretty much with stuff I've seen before, so that's good. So let's go straight to questions then. I'll make a list, and we'll work our way through. And if you want your question to be directed to a particular individual, please do say. Otherwise, we'll let the panel of 4, as it were, decide who's going to answer. That's probably the best way to do it. So who wants to go first? Judith.
Yes, thank you for the update. I find that really very, very encouraging that so much work has been achieved, and especially with regard to the flooding issues and the outlines you gave us about how that's going to be managed, and then that sort of really underpins everything else once that's more or less you know, you've got a handle on how that's going to be managed. What I was just going to ask was the listings, the new listings that have been announced, do they present you with, or present the site with, any sort of challenges that that you hadn't foreseen?
I have to defer to Anthony on that one.
Well, I think they present the site with wonderful opportunities that we were already sort of excited about. I think that's probably the best way to frame the listing review. It was sort of, I suppose, slightly tricky time-wise, because we were dealing with a kind of unknown, but there was no buildings that were identified in the new listing review that we had earmarked for demolition, or that we weren't interested in retention and embedded those existing structures into the master plan itself. So in that sense, we were entirely relaxed about the review and hearing what the review entailed, basically. I think it's a very useful, thorough bit of work that makes sure that heritage is at the heart of decision making, and we are absolutely thrilled about that. In principle, there are some incredible structures and an amazing history, both physical and social history, associated with the site, and the prospect of it opening up is a really exciting one. So I think it was welcome, and there were no great surprises. I think that's not to say there aren't some difficult decisions yet to be made in detail about what actually happens, because all we're doing is setting out a kind of relatively high level strategy. There will be detailed proposals that come forward, and the planning authorities will need to make decisions about specific planning applications that relate to those listed heritage structures. So it may be that at that time, decisions will need to be made about what the developer wants versus what the heritage authorities might like to see. You know, we've had feedback from Historic England, which continues to raise some concerns about the level of development and heights, etc. So there are issues still to be managed, but I think in the round, it was a very helpful process that further emphasised the importance of heritage and the opportunities that the site presents.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've got Leslie, then I've got Ian.
Thank you. I've got two questions. It all looks very encouraging. I just want to ask about, from the pictures, it looks like there's an awful lot of flat roofs and hard landscaping. And I'm wondering if the flat roofs will be used either for open space or for solar or whatever, rather than just dead open space. And my other question is about the 4,000 jobs, and I'm wondering where the numbers come from, because it looks to be mostly residential. But I have this picture of people building really high quality zero carbon homes, and I know that's a different task and a different skill to retrofitting existing homes, but I'm kind of hopeful that some of those skills will be transferable for when we have a proper retrofitting strategy. But perhaps you could explain that a bit more, please, the numbers and what the jobs would actually be.
Anthony, do you want to cover the first and I'll cover the second?
Sure. Thanks, Councillor. Flat roofs and opportunities that they present, I think, is a very good point, actually. And I think perhaps on the good news is that we aren't identifying the flat roof, that the space that flat roofs take. We are not reliant on those in providing the open space that the site needs to provide. But I think that the opportunity of making best use of flat roofs in terms of rainwater management, growing, informal recreation, and potentially energy generation. I think all of those things actually could be, those points could be made expressly in the SPD. So I think that is a very good opportunity that we can raise and incorporate in the next iteration of the plan.
Thanks.
And then Martin, in terms of the jobs.
And I think actually also, just before I move on, I suppose the other point I'd raise on that around the ability to generate energy or something from them is what we've sort of had in that long list of infrastructure is neatly badged, because we don't know what the technology will be, because I'm not sure anyone knows what technology will be at this point for such a big development over such a long period, about achieving net zero from development. So we actually have an uplift on all of the development costs, so our normal build costs for apartments and commercial buildings, to allow for that technology to be built in. So again, in terms of embedding it in the delivery strategy and giving it as best chance as possible for it to happen in the way we all want it to, that is also embedded into the cost of solar or on-site generation or whatever it may be, ground source heat pumps, whatever the technology is, we can be used eventually. There's the viability assessment and all of that sort of takes that into account. So I think that was just important. I just wanted to make that. The 4,000 jobs, a really interesting question. And on other days in other parts of my life, that's probably the thing that vexes me more than anything else, because it's by heart I'm an economist. But I think, the way that's calculated is it's calculated off the volume of employment space that sits within that master plan, and also the nature of the job. So 4,100 jobs that we have is a capacity within the buildings based on some assumptions. Now, we've got some different mixes of uses, and I'll try and do this as simply and I'll explain it as clearly as I can without a drawing to hand to show you. But effectively what we've got is a mix of sort of office jobs, and that in terms of working with the sorts of sectors that Norwich has already been successful in having. So whether that's sort of professional services, sort of creative and sort of digital, Unlikely to be a location for the likes of the life sciences at this point in time, given the concentration on the other side of the city. But effectively, there's a cluster of sort of reuse and some new provision of that sort of office workspace to the northwest, so around Carrow House and some of the retained buildings that will be on that sort of entrance point, the point closest to the city and the point closest to the station, which we think is the most sustainable. And as we move through, we've obviously got, as we talked to you in stage one about, we've got almost like a new version of the high street along that east-west link, that pedestrian, cycle, potentially public transport east-west link, which gives you retail, leisure uses. So, you know, all those things that are sort of supporting the residential and the working community. Anthony pointed out when we talked about the master plan changes that we then have some opportunities to deliver some other types of workspace along the rail corridor to create some better separation between those, that heavy infrastructure. And now that is light industrial workshop type spaces. So I think, Councillor Graham, your point about retrofitting, you know, obviously we have a passive house business on site already. The opportunity potentially to have accommodation that suits them and have their skills reused on the site would exist, because it would be the type of facility, type of spaces they could use, obviously subject to all sorts of other conversations in time. And then I suppose where the big numbers come from is when we look at the utilities site and the opportunity there to create something a bit more significant in terms of for want of a better way of putting an employment campus. So we've got the zone that sits closest to Crown Point Depot and is quite impacted by its proximity to that facility and the long-term operation of that facility. There's an opportunity to do something that's much more I was going to say a supply-led, so, you know, creating the capacity and the opportunity and the setting to attract either a larger business involved in sort of research and development. It could be supplemented with sort of higher education or further education sort of support as well. So, you know, we've really built in some opportunity there to do something a bit different for the city. Obviously, you know, work to be done about exactly what form that takes, who that is and what that might be, but certainly creating the opportunity there. So there's a significant amount of jobs. And then across the wider area, we do have things like jobs that will be triggered from the visitor economy, the marinas, and sort of a mix in there. But it's really a pretty diverse economy, aiming to provide space for small businesses and for people who are doing hybrid working, and then all of those sort of ancillary uses that you would want to see close to where people live.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Yeah. One more question is whether you'd be willing to share the slides.
I think we've already shared them with your officer colleagues, so yeah, hopefully that's fine.
Thank you.
And yeah, that 4,000 is very much a maximum quantum, isn't it? And it's based on originally on some work that was done a few years ago, but it's still a current figure. Yeah. And the other thing is, of course, just to be clear that at the moment, any illustrations we use are indicative, because clearly there will need to be detailed planning applications at a much later stage for the specifics of the development. So at the moment, they are just indicative, but indicative of what we might expect. So Ian, next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all for the presentation. The Trouse rail bridge is one set of infrastructure that is in need of an upgrade, and arguably the development and the opportunities that go with it won't be realised until that upgrade is complete. Can you tell us how the bridge fits into this, what work you've done with it, and have you contacted the East-West Rail Partnership about the plans? Thank you.
Chair, I'll take that one if you like, because I'm probably close to some of those issues, and Martin can chip in if there's anything.
Because of course, Network Rail are a very active member of the partnership board, aren't they? Of course.
Yeah. I think, Chair, what certainly I've come to realise in my my brief 3 months here is that whilst there is this aspiration for the Trouse Rail line to be twin-tracked and Norwich in 90, an absolutely admirable aspiration, I think the city really should be pushing and lobbying for, and Obviously, there are changes in working from home now and post-COVID, or coming out the other side of COVID, changes which may, I'm quite sure, put a different context, if you like, around that decision to be made. But the point about our work for the master plan is that, yes, we can't be delayed by that or affected by that timetable. Therefore, physically, the master plan would allow for a second track. And the whole issue, which Councillor, perhaps is part behind your question as well, of whether that would be a fixed bridge or opening bridge, that is the big question that I've been asking everybody since I've got here. And finally, Graham Nelson and I have got the chance on Friday with a workshop with Broads Authority officers to really start cracking that, because there is a really big issue here, because the timetable for looking at the bridges as part of this master plan, as you saw, there are two of them that cross the Wensum, both a pedestrian cycle bridge on the western side, going to Geoffrey Watling Way, and then the bridge that will cross into the utilities site. Both of those bridges could quite probably, hopefully, come forward before Network Rail can make any sort of decision about their railway line, much as everybody might like that decision to be brought forward. And again, I can only urge that the authorities within the city, the bids and Chamber of Commerce and everybody else really rally together to actually push for that that message. So the Trails Bridge can physically be accommodated whatever and whenever that decision has been made. The sequencing of decisions about bridges, though, is very interesting and difficult and complex, because of course it's the first fixed bridge that in effect would trigger the requirement for a compensation measure regarding the navigation access into the port. So again, that's the purpose of the workshop, largely with the Broads Authority members on Friday, that Graham Nelson and I will be trying to unravel and unpick some of that. I suppose from that, the key thing is to have a fair and equitable and a pragmatic approach to that, because there are going to be huge cost impacts if out of all of that unraveling, if you like, the various decisions that need to be made, and there's a whole series of decision making at a whole number of different levels, there's an expectation or even a requirement that the bridges for our master plan need to be opening bridges rather than fixed bridges, obviously in cost terms for capital costs and also future maintenance costs. So there's a lot of unpicking to do from that. And Councillor, that may be in a fuller answer than you're, or longer answer than you were expecting. But the bottom line is that the Trails Bridge isn't going to be the first decision to affect all these other issues regarding compensation measures, and by which I'm really talking about the need for and the benefit of a marina. And just to emphasise on that, perhaps it's not just a compensation measure. Sounds a terribly dull phrase, doesn't it? A marina, or marinas plural, there are two proposed as part of this, would be such a fantastic part of the placemaking and the destination creating for this development. And I think overall the East Norwich Master Plan, or the East Norwich generation, needs to have that kind of level of placemaking, destination quality about it to really achieve all the other, award-winning, best practice, exemplar, kind of tags I think we would all want to see attached to these fabulous opportunities. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ian. And the other thing that I've learned, just sort of reinforcing that, is that Network Rail's lead-in times for decisions about capital investment are quite. I'm aware that we're broadcasting, but I heard the word glacial used recently. So one wouldn't expect that to happen hugely quickly, which is why we need to build in the ability for it to happen, but subject to everything that Ian has just said. It is really complex, isn't it? Okay. Does that answer your question, Ian?
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's in your thoughts, and that's the main thing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. So we've got Adam next. Adam.
Thanks, Mike. I was going to ask about the phasing in relation to community facilities, i.e. education and healthcare. How far into the development would you look for such community facilities to be brought forward? And what will the interim and will those sectors be able to cope in the interim with the development being developed before such facilities are in place? Thanks.
It's a really important one for the SPD to set some thoughts out on, Anthony. So I'm not sure there's much you particularly want to emphasise just now, other than we will need to, from a planning point of view and future planning applications, make sure that there is an understanding about trigger points, and for things like schools, for example, where clearly there are triggers that the Education Authority will identify, that there are the mechanisms in place to then deliver that infrastructure that's necessary. So, clearly with a series of sites of this scale, it is really, really important to understand some of those triggers and when community and other infrastructure would therefore be required, and to make sure that not just as a planning condition or a Section 106 requiring it, but there's actually a delivery mechanism, probably for some of those facilities, including public funding. And that was something I just meant to mention before, actually, that my consultant colleagues are, as I would expect them to and want them to, putting a kind of a positive gloss on all this, because there's a lot of good work and a lot of great opportunity here. There's absolutely the need for public sector funding to be able to deliver what is needed as part of this. And that'll be one of the impacts, no doubt, on some of the triggers for some of the community facilities, potentially. Yeah,
I think just to follow on that, there's sort of two things. There's one, which is the technical trigger points, and that relates mainly to things like education and health. So effectively, you deliver so many homes, you need to then trigger off delivering the school or the health facility. So as I sort of covered in the presentation, we've been having conversations with the relevant sort of technical stakeholders to understand what they are. The second element, though, which plays inside, and hopefully the councillor sort of helps answer your question a bit more as well, is there's also then the development phasing, and there's sort of some thoughts in the land use strategy of the master plan that you saw at stage 1 and in the emerging SPD document around where some of these facilities and important assets will sit physically. And then it's about, well, when do they come forward as well as development sites, and then how do they get done? So we're trying to bring the two together from a sort of practical, when will you be building stuff, where will these things be best located and connected and all of those things, and how do they co-locate with other uses to make them viable in the operational sense. So there's sort of two elements to that. From a school perspective, we're very clear it comes pretty early on in the whole, if we're looking at 3,600 homes, it's in the first elements of that. We need the school as a technical trigger, but also as a placemaking opportunity as well. People buy houses where there are schools and facilities, and that's an important thing to consider in terms of us being able to show that this is deliverable. So I think Ian, entirely take what you've said, but I think there's just that other element of actually practically thinking through when will particular sites or plots within the sites come forward, and what are the uses that we envisage in this indicative master plan as being on them, and how does that play through. So yeah, the two sit together, but ultimately, to reassure you, we haven't back-ended all of the infrastructure that sits within that phasing strategy over time. It's not like, well, we'll deliver all the houses, make all the money, and then do the thing that costs us at the end. It's the point for doing the infrastructure delivery plan and all the viability testing at this stage is to understand doing these things hand in glove as we go through. So hopefully that's a helpful process for all of you.
Thank you. Denise. Denise, hello, are you there? Oh, there you are. And you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sorry about that. Yes, the master plan's really coming on in leaps and bounds now, but I might have missed a stage, because the initial brief referred to 4,000 new homes and 6,000 new jobs, and now stage 2 is looking at 3,600 odd new homes and 4,100 new jobs. And I wondered if the smaller numbers in relation to housing, for example, relates to the new flooding information and also the new county wildlife site boundary, as the plan seems to show housing on the deal ground, I think, overlapping the county wildlife site. Then my second question is, what is the master plan proposing to reduce, what infrastructure hopefully not infrastructure, proposing to reduce vehicle pressures on the County Hall roundabout and also the King Street, the Brackendale junction, please. And then my third point is the Bath scheme that you picture shows a lot of hard landscaping along the river frontage. And there's also some green infrastructure, but I wondered whether East Norwich will strive to truly green the river corridor and to reduce the amount of hard landscaping overall. Thank you.
Shall I start in responding? Thanks for the questions. The difference between the original capacity figures that were mentioned in the policy, the draft policy, came from a higher level piece of work that was done a few years ago. And so effectively what we've had the opportunity to do is to look in more detail and test in more detail the deliverability of those numbers. And so the numbers that we're talking about now have a stronger evidence base behind them. So that explains the general difference, specifically in relation to the difference between the November stage 1 and the current phase of work, where the houses have gone up a little bit, aren't actually anything to do with the county wildlife site boundary. They are just a function of reviewing the master plan, trying to make it work as hard as possible, listening to some of the feedback we received from some of the landowners and their views on making it as deliverable as possible, and making changes and washing those changes through accordingly. The county wildlife site boundary change, we've had a look at the boundary change, and the master plan as it's now been revised doesn't encroach on the new boundary that is being taken forward through the GNLP process. So in making an adjustment to the master plan to take account of the two boundaries and the boundary change, we've sort of struck a balanced overall balance of unit provision. So we aren't losing any units as a result of the boundary change in our master plan. But as I said, this is not a blueprint. This is a framework that can be measured, basically. So I think that probably deals with the first part of the question. The second part of the question, you're gonna have to remind me.
Yes, it was asking. It may be that it's too detailed at this stage, but how the master plan will propose to reduce vehicle pressures on the County Hall roundabout and also the King Street Brackendale junction.
Right.
Yep,
so I suppose we are aware of the current traffic issues that are associated with the roundabout and King Street, etc. The priority that we've had to focus on is minimizing, working to set a framework that minimizes dependency on car trips for making the sites work. So the emphasis is squarely placed on, firstly, active, and secondly, sustainable modes of transport supporting the new development. And that is done through the provision of an open and permeable network of pedestrian and cycle routes through the site, as well as the importance of promoting new public transport corridors that would serve the site, and stops that would be positioned to serve all of the site as a whole, because it's probably really realistically only the Carrow worksite itself that has any realistic prospect of being directly served by a new bus route. And even that, there's still discussions to be had about that with the operators. I think when plan applications come forward, they will have to undertake traffic impact assessments that show in more detail the impact on the existing road network. That's not something that we've done at this stage. It's premature to do at this stage. But the emphasis is squarely placed on promoting active and sustainable modes of transport to support the new developments. There is plenty more work to be done to understand more fully the impact on the existing road network, given that there are pressure points on that network in this part of the city. So there, the piece of work that's associated with producing the SPD doesn't extend into modelling the traffic implications of new development, but that is work that will need to be done to support planning applications. All of that said, it is a tricky issue for sure, because it's a busy part of town. It's a town that's got the rivers to contend with. So the kind of outer ring road breaks down in this part of the town. So there are going to be issues, and there will certainly need to be further work and careful decisions made. I think there were 3 questions.
I just had a couple of things onto that answer actually before we lose that one. I think part of the answer also is this objective we've always got as planners for the 20-minute neighbourhood, and to try and get as many facilities co-located within the area as possible. The school, the health facility, the retail facility, other service or community facilities, for example, so that as many people as possible within the wider development of the 3 sites, including those on the deal ground and utilities site, won't want to just hop in the car and drive round. They will actually be able to walk or cycle or wheel, as it's being called now much more, to those facilities. And the way to do that, as Anthony's been saying, really, is to make those walking and cycling routes as attractive and safe and convenient as possible. It really should be as simple as that. I'm afraid it doesn't very often seem to work out like that, but that comes down to quality of provision. It comes down to who's going to adopt or maintain or look after those routes. And of course, that's a big discussion with the county council. And of course, they have views on what they can continue to fund and maintain and so on. So commuted sums from developers. So there's another whole set of conversations there about how you actually achieve that quality provision to achieve the objective that you've mentioned about actually wanting to reduce car usage. Obviously, the bus route that was referred to as before is a key part of that as well. So, you know, it's there's too good an opportunity here for this key brownfield site, not only brownfield, but right on the edge of the city centre. Our friends in Homes England that we're working closely with are saying this is one of the biggest, I think they're saying the best as well, city centre or edge of city brownfield sites in the country, not just the east of England. You know, we're all fighting off the greenfield proposers. Certainly there's a bit of that in the local plan, as it were. But here we've got a site that we're being 10 to 15 minutes walk from the station, from the edge of the city centre and so on. We've got to get it right here. So I think the fundamentals in the supplementary planning document, as Anthony's been setting out, you know, will clearly establish that framework. I'll endorse what I've heard a couple of times from Anthony and I think Martin, which, you know, there will be, I'm quite sure, we can see it and hear it already to some extent, some planning challenges or even battles regarding some of these points. But I think the City Council, as a council, the local planning authority as the planning authority, the county as the highway authority, needs to stick firm on this to try and get these points right. It's only in new developments like this where we can really get that best practice exemplar approach, rather than retrofitting or stitching in the very thing that you're seeking here as well. So the SPD will set that framework for trying to get that balance right. It does sometimes, well, it costs money, it might cost more money. There are issues there, obviously, that needs to be addressed with the county in particular as the highway authority and regarding adoption standards and so on as well. So I hope that just helps give some insight, if you like, into how we're approaching this and to ensure that those fundamental principles are addressed and are addressed at this early stage as we are, excuse me, in a way that the SPD will set out. And it will be for those incoming developers. One of them, as you know, Fuel Properties for the Unilever site are already, you know, on that trail. They've already had one pre-app meeting with the planners. It was just before Christmas. I've been a bit surprised they haven't pushed that further, but now that seems to be happening, or at least other meetings are being set up. So there are very live conversations that will be going on fairly soon regarding the Carrow Works aspect of these Norwich sites.
Thank you.
And the third question, before anyone forgets, or Chair, I'm sure you wouldn't have forgotten, but was about green infrastructure on the river. And I think it's a very high early stage and a high level, master plan at this stage. Yeah. So what you've observed or picked up perhaps, and the Bath images were just images to demonstrate the levels issues rather than what would apply here in this particular case. But yes, there'll have to be a suitable element of greening and green infrastructure and use of natural and indigenous materials and all the rest of it to try and get that softness and that green character to the river rather than just hard areas. Of course, one of the absolute fascinations here is, and I've seen the tagline written before, we are really talking from city to Broads, and that interconnectivity, both ways round, as it were, which doesn't happen, I don't think, in any other city or area in the country in terms of a national park penetrating a city quite as much, is so key. So you have got the opportunity for that transition in terms of character areas from the greater greener emphasis, I guess, on the eastern side, more to the hard and heritage based river edge on the western side. But all that balance would come through. There'll be reflections on that in the SPD. And then again, individual planning applications obviously have to demonstrate. This is the important thing about an SPD. It sets out objectives, not necessarily become prescriptive in how they're met. So the objectives for wanting appropriate riverside treatment, appropriate quality of riverside walkways and so on, again, the management and stewardship and maintenance being particularly key. But individual planning applications will then need to demonstrate how they meet those objectives.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive response. Adam.
Sorry.
Thanks, Mike. I was going to ask to see if there's been any update, any progress on potential housing tenure mix on the site. Thanks.
In terms of
in terms of what would be viable to deliver.
Well, at the moment, all of the work at the moment is predicated on policy compliant levels of affordable housing. So, as I said, we're sort of in the process at the minute of doing that viability testing. Where we are at this point is, we've been testing the 35% with the 85-15 split between affordable rent and shared ownership as the base case. We are testing sensitivities around that just to understand how much difference that makes to viability. But at the moment, subject to the point Ian made earlier, where we've got an overarching need to look at public sector funding to deliver, it sits in the round with all of that where we are at the work at the moment. So we're still working through that, Councillor, is the honest answer.
Okay, are there any more questions? Good discussion, a very comprehensive presentation as well, and very comprehensive answers to the questions. So we're all very grateful for that. If there are no other questions, I'd just like to thank Martin and Anthony and Ian and indeed Judith for coming along for this item today and for your very full and comprehensive answers. It's been very helpful, I'm sure, for the committee. We're noting this, so we're not being asked to make any decision relating to it. And I know you'll be back in due course to give us further updates as we go forward. But it is a very exciting project to be engaged with, involved with. And as Ian has said, we've got to get this absolutely right, and we're doing our absolute best to do that. So thank you very much for that. And thank you everyone for attending today. And we get to go with 20 minutes to spare. That's not bad either.